The first thing the darkness takes is distance. A step beyond the last grey wash of daylight, the floor seems to tilt. The ceiling lowers, and the walls stop behaving like walls. Stone swells into shoulders, hollows into eyes, cracks into ribs. A small flame does not reveal the cave so much as negotiate with it. One horse appears, then vanishes when the hand carrying the lamp shifts. A horn emerges from a bulge in the limestone. A black line becomes the back of an animal only when the viewer stands from the right place. Nothing is presented all at once. The images arrive in fragments, and the cave controls the order in which they are seen. That simple fact changes the mystery. Lascaux and Chauvet are often described as galleries, but a gallery is designed for open viewing, steady light, easy movement, and the comfort of knowing where the room ends. These caves offer the opposite. Their decorated spaces lie beyond ordinary daylight, in chambers that demand preparation, balance, memory, and trust. They carried fuel. They protected flame. They moved through constrictions, slopes, damp passages, and zones where a wrong step could end the journey. They entered a world where vision became narrow and selective, where sound returned from unseen surfaces, and where the human body could never forget that it was underground. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, then let the daylight fall behind. At Chauvet, the sealed entrance preserved an interior that still feels almost interrupted rather than abandoned. Cave bare bones lie on the floor, claw marks score the walls, charcoal traces record ancient contact with the stone. In some places, real animals and painted animals occupy the same underground world. A bear skull once rested on a stone block in a position that has invited decades of speculation. It may have been placed deliberately, but the evidence remains incomplete, and no single interpretation can recover the intention behind it. Nearby, drawn lions advance across the wall without manes, rhinoceroses overlap in restless lines, and horses emerge from darkness with a control that seems startlingly assured. Lascaux creates a different impression. Its great painted animals appear larger, brighter, and more expansive. Yet they too belong to a space that modern photographs flatten. The famous Hall of the Bulls is not a rectangular room with pictures hung at eye level. Its surfaces bend, rise, and narrow. The animals occupy curves, ledges, and irregular planes. Some seem stretched because the artist anticipated the viewer's position. Others gain volume from natural relief. A painted back follows a ridge, and a belly swells with the rock. The cave is not merely the support for the image, it participates in the image. This is why a virtual tour, a replica, or a photograph can be accurate and still fail to reproduce the original encounter. Modern light reveals too much, turning a sequence into an inventory. Under a torch or grease lamp, the eye would catch only a muzzle, a flank, a pair of horns, or the white gleam of scraped limestone. The brain would complete what the flame withheld. Movement of the light could make a repeated outline tremble. A change of angle might cause one animal to recede while another took form. The painted world was never static like a book illustration. It depended on the body of the observer. Sound deepened that dependence. Footsteps change character from corridor to chamber. A voice could flatten against one wall and bloom against another. Water, breath, stone contact, and flame all produce signals in a place where vision was weak. Some researchers have explored whether decorated zones coincide with unusual resonance. An early acoustic work at Chauvet adds new detail to that question. Yet caution matters. Echoes influenced experience, but they do not prove that every image belonged to a ritual performance, a song, or a ceremony. The caves may have hosted varied actions across long periods, and cave art may be a modern label covering behaviours that Ice Age people themselves kept distinct. The darkness also altered social relations. Whoever led the way controlled direction, pace, and access to light. Whoever knew the route possessed practical knowledge that could not be improvised. A group might move together, but not everyone could stand before the same panel at once. Some images occupy open chambers, others are hidden in difficult or restricted spaces. This unevenness suggests choices about audience, timing, and participation, though scholars still debate whether those choices were religious, social, instructional, political, or something for which modern language has no good equivalent. It is tempting to imagine a lone genius disappearing into the earth to create in secret. The evidence points towards something more complicated. Pigments had to be gathered and prepared. Fuel had to be carried. Tools had to be chosen. In some places, scaffolding or raised supports may have been required. Certain panels appear to contain work from different moments, perhaps different hands. The cave therefore becomes not only an artistic setting, but a logistical project. Even one visit depended on shared knowledge where to find manganese, iron oxides, charcoal, suitable stone, animal fat, fibres for wicks, and safe passages below. Yet the practical explanation does not exhaust the mystery. People could mark stone in daylight. They could carve portable objects beside a hearth. They could paint on exposed rock surfaces. Instead, at Lascaux and Chauvet, they repeatedly brought images into places where ordinary life was difficult. The underground setting must have mattered. Perhaps it intensified memory. Perhaps it separated certain acts from daily routine. Perhaps it made the animals seem to emerge from within the earth itself. Pareidolia, the human tendency to recognize forms in natural shapes, may have guided the first marks. But that still leaves the deeper question of why those forms were completed, revisited, and preserved in darkness. The caves were not empty containers waiting for decoration. They were active environments with their own hazards, acoustics, textures, temperatures, smells, and histories. Bears had occupied Chauvet. Mineral films had grown. Water had traced roots through the stone. Human visitors entered landscapes already shaped by forces older than any tradition they carried. To paint there was to respond to something that already existed. So the opening question is not simply why Ice Age people made art. It is why they chose to make some of their most complex images where seeing was hardest. Were these chambers sanctuaries, memory theatres, teaching spaces, territorial archives, places of transformation, or settings for stories spoken into darkness? Every answer captures part of the experience and leaves another part untouched. What survives on the walls tells us that the descent was deliberate. It does not tell us what the darkness meant. The darkness that shaped the first encounters with the caves also shaped the histories that followed. Lascaux entered the modern world in September 1940 at a moment when France itself was living under occupation and uncertainty. Near the village of Montignac, Marcel Ravidar noticed an opening in the ground. Later retellings often place his dog robot at the centre of the discovery, sometimes suggesting that the animal fell into the hole and led the boys to the cave. The details vary between accounts, and the safest version is less theatrical. Ravidat found the opening, returned with Jacques Marsal, Georges Agnel, and Simon Coencas, and together they enlarged their way into the underground space. What waited below was not a hidden chamber with a single painted wall, but an entire system of images spreading across ceilings, curves, passages, and chambers. Their first lamps would have given them only pieces of what they had found. The great bulls did not appear as a complete composition in one glance. One body emerged, then another. Horses multiplied along the walls. Antlers rose into the dark. The scale of the animals, the freshness of the pigments, and the density of the decoration made the cave seem less like a ruin than a place whose makers had only recently stepped away. Yet the people who first entered could not know its age, its cultural setting, or how fragile its equilibrium might be. They knew only that the stone was covered with images unlike anything in ordinary experience. News spread quickly. Scholars arrived. The cave became famous, then public. Visitors descended in large numbers, bringing electric light, heat, moisture, carbon dioxide, dust, and microorganisms into an environment that had remained comparatively stable for thousands of years. The success of Lascaux as a cultural attraction became part of its danger. By the 1950s, changes appeared on the walls. Condensation, microbial growth, and altered air circulation threatened the paintings. In 1963, the original cave was closed to the general public. That decision preserved what could still be protected, but it also transformed Lascaux into a paradox. One of the most famous decorated caves in the world became a place almost no one could enter. The decades that followed produced replicas, controlled studies, conservation campaigns, and repeated warnings about how little interference a cave can tolerate. Lascaux's modern history therefore became inseparable from damage, rescue, and the difficult lesson that discovery is not a single moment. A cave can be found physically and still be misunderstood scientifically. It can be opened in celebration and then closed in alarm. Every intervention changes the evidence, sometimes in ways that become visible only years later. 54 years after Lascaux, another team entered another darkness under very different conditions. On December 18, 1994, Jean-Marie Chauvet, Eliette Brunel, and Christian Hilaire were exploring near the Pont d'Arc in the Ardèche region of southern France. Air moving from a small opening suggested a larger cavity beyond. The entrance had been sealed by a prehistoric rockfall, and access required negotiation with a narrow route. Once inside, the explorers encountered chambers marked not only by painted and engraved animals, but by footprints, charcoal, bones, and signs of cave bears. The walls held lions, rhinoceroses, horses, bears, mammoths, bison, and other animals rendered with a technical confidence that seemed almost incompatible with the great age later proposed for them. The discoverers understood immediately that the cave demanded restraint. By 1994, archaeology had already learned from Lascaux and from many other damaged sites. The first visitors to Chauvet moved carefully, documented what they could, and avoided treating the cave as a place to be opened. The entrance was secured. Access remained tightly controlled. Researchers later followed designated pathways and worked under strict limits intended to reduce disturbance. Chauvet did not pass through the same phase of mass tourism that had transformed Lascaux's climate. Its modern history began with the assumption that preservation had to come before public access. That contrast matters because it affects what each cave can still tell us. At Lascaux, early excavation, visitation, lighting, and conservation altered the environment and complicated the record. At Chauvet, sealed conditions preserved extraordinarily delicate traces, footprints on the floor, charcoal marks, animal remains, and the spatial relationship between human activity and the natural cave. This does not mean Chauvet is untouched, or that its evidence speaks without interpretation. Every scientific visit introduces some change. Sampling removes material. Pathways privilege certain views. Even the act of naming panels and chambers imposes order. But the level of control at Chauvet has allowed researchers to study a prehistoric surface that remains unusually coherent. The two discoveries also change public imagination in different ways. Lascaux appeared during the mid-20th century as a revelation of Ice Age sophistication. Its bulls, horses, and stags seemed to prove that people commonly caricatured as primitive possessed observation, planning, symbolism, and artistic control. Chauvet produced a second shock. Its earliest major phase was far older than Lascaux, yet its drawings included shading, overlapping contours, perspective, and convincing movement. The old expectation that art should begin crudely and improve in a simple upward sequence became harder to defend. Mastery did not wait politely at the end of prehistory. Replicas became the compromise between access and protection. Lascaux, too, later visitor centres, and the full-scale reconstruction known as Lascaux 4 attempted to recreate the decorated surfaces without exposing the original. Chauvet received its own replica, the Chauvet II Ardèche, built to convey the cave's scale, imagery, humidity, silence, and underground atmosphere. These reconstructions are feats of measurement and craft. They can reproduce contours to extraordinary accuracy. They allow millions of people to see compositions that would otherwise remain available only to specialists. Still, a replica inevitably clarifies what the original obscured. It offers safe flooring, managed circulation, stable lighting, and a known exit. The visitor knows that the darkness is controlled. The Ice Age entrant did not experience the cave as heritage. The modern explorer did not enter knowing that UNESCO recognition, conservation laboratories, and digital archives would follow. Each discovery created a new cave layered over the old one, the prehistoric place, the archaeological site, the public symbol, and the endangered environment. Between 1940 and 1994, the discipline changed from rapid revelation toward controlled observation, though never perfectly. Lascaux taught that admiration could destroy the object admired. Chauvet showed what could be preserved when access was restricted from the beginning. Together, their modern histories reveal that the mystery is shaped not only by what Ice Age people left behind, but by how later people enter, record, illuminate, and protect it. Yet the two caves do not belong to the same moment in prehistory. Beneath their shared fame lies a chronological distance so large that it separates different climates, different artistic traditions, and human communities living more than 10,000 years apart. The great distance between Chauvet and Lascaux is easy to lose when both are reduced to the phrase Ice Age cave art. The words make them sound like neighbouring rooms in a single cultural house. They were not. The earliest major phase at Chauvet belongs to the Aurignacian, when modern humans had only relatively recently established themselves across much of Europe. The principal human use of the cave has been placed roughly between 37,000 and 33,500 years ago, with a later period of activity around 31,000 to 28,000 years ago. Lascaux, by contrast, belongs to a much later world. Archaeological material from the cave points toward human activity around 21,500 to 21,000 years ago, though the paintings themselves cannot all be assigned securely to one moment. Between the two sites lies more time than separates the earlier cities from the present day. That span was not empty. Europe changed repeatedly under the pressure of climate, ice, vegetation, animal migration and human movement. The land beyond Chauvet was part of a cold but varied environment. Rivers cut through limestone, cliffs offered shelter, and shifting vegetation created a mosaic of habitats: steppe, open woodland, river valleys, and exposed limestone landscapes supported horses, reindeer, bison, ibex, mammoths, rhinoceroses, lions, wolves, and bears. The famous cave bears of Chauvet were not merely creatures remembered by artists. Their bones, claw marks, wool polishing, and footprints show that they physically occupied the cave. Humans entered a space already used by powerful animals, sometimes during different periods, perhaps avoiding seasons when bears denned there, though the exact rhythms remain uncertain. The people associated with Chauvet lived in small, mobile communities whose survival depended on close knowledge of seasonal movement, raw materials, weather, and terrain. They made blades and other stone tools, worked bone and antler, produced personal ornaments, and carried symbolic traditions across distances. Their lives were not static, and their art should not be imagined as the isolated invention of one valley. Similarities and differences across ornaments, tools, portable images, and decorated sites suggest social connections extending beyond local groups. What survives in the record suggests communities capable of transmitting complex practices, but archaeology cannot show precisely how an apprentice learned, who was permitted to paint, or whether particular images belong to stories shared across regions. By the time people used Lascaux, the climatic and cultural setting had shifted dramatically. Europe was approaching the coldest part of the last glacial cycle. Ice sheets covered enormous northern territories, mountain glaciers expanded, and much of Western Europe experienced conditions colder and drier than today. Yet the popular image of a uniformly frozen wasteland is misleading. Southwestern France lay beyond the great continental ice sheets. Its valleys, plateaus, river systems, and seasonal grasslands formed a productive but demanding landscape. Herds moved through it. Plants returned in brief growing seasons. Human groups followed resources, revisited favored places, and maintained networks over wide territories. The animal worlds represented at the two caves reflect more than simple environmental lists. Chauvet gives unusual prominence to animals often described as dangerous or rarely hunted: lions, rhinoceroses, bears, and mammoths. Lascaux is dominated by horses, aurochs, bison, and deer. These differences may reflect changing ecosystems, changing traditions, different purposes, or the choices of particular communities. No single explanation fully accounts for them. The presence of an animal on a wall does not prove that it was common outside, central to the diet, feared, worshipped, or understood in one fixed way. Images can preserve ecological observation while also carrying social meanings that leave no material trace. Even the caves themselves belong to different histories. Chauvet's entrance was eventually sealed by rockfall, protecting the interior from later disturbance. Human visits ended, while the cave's microenvironment helped preserve charcoal, footprints, and fragile floor evidence. Lascaux remained part of another geological setting, and later suffered a radically different modern fate. Their survival histories shape what can be compared. Chauvet's chronology can draw on numerous radiocarbon dates from charcoal images, torch marks, and other organic material. Lascaux is more resistant because many black pigments are mineral, especially manganese dioxide, and contain no carbon suitable for direct radiocarbon dating. This difference is crucial. A date from charcoal in a cave may identify when that particular charcoal formed or was used. A date from a lamp, bone object, or hearth records an episode of human activity. It does not automatically date every nearby image. At Lascaux, researchers compare archaeological layers, stylistic features, pigment composition, tool marks, and dated objects to build a chronology. The resulting picture is persuasive in broad outline but unstable in detail. Scholars still debate whether parts of the decoration belong to one concentrated campaign or several episodes. The evidence allows a prehistoric framework, not a single birthday for the painted complex. The temptation to arrange Chauvet and Lascaux as stages in an artistic progression is equally misleading. Chauvet is older, but its lions, horses, and rhinoceroses show control of line, shading, overlap, and movement. Lascaux is later, yet it is not simply more advanced. It follows different conventions, emphasizes different animals, uses space differently, and may express traditions that cannot be ranked on one ladder. Human creativity does not move neatly from crude beginnings toward perfection. Technical brilliance also cannot reveal an image's purpose, since accomplished drawing may serve ritual, memory, instruction, display, or overlapping functions. Skills can appear early, change direction, vanish locally, or be reinvented under new social conditions. The Ice Age itself was not a single climate. Temperatures fluctuated, habitats expanded and contracted, animal ranges shifted. Human populations may have grown, fragmented, retreated, and reconnected. During harsher phases, communities faced narrower resource windows and greater mobility demands. During relatively milder intervals, some landscapes became more accessible. These changes influenced where people traveled, where they found pigments and stone, and which caves they encountered. Yet environmental pressure alone cannot explain why one group covered a chamber with lions, while another later filled a rotunda with monumental cattle. To stand mentally between Chauvet and Lascaux is therefore to look across many generations who never knew one another. Stories could persist for centuries, perhaps millennia, but more than 10,000 years tests any assumption of direct continuity. Traditions may have been inherited, transformed, lost, or independently renewed. The shared act of placing images underground does not prove a shared religion. It may instead reveal a recurring human recognition that caves offered unusual conditions for memory, attention, secrecy, and imagination. Both sites belong to the Upper Paleolithic, but that label is a shelf created by modern archaeology. The people themselves inhabited immediate worlds of weather, animals, roots, kin, hunger, skill, and remembered places. Chauvet and Lascaux preserved 2 points within that immense span, not the full history between them. Their paintings are survivors from different Ice Age worlds, linked by darkness and separated by time. The distance between the two caves makes Chauvet's achievement more unsettling, not less. Its earliest major images belong to a world tens of millennia old, yet they refuse to look like hesitant beginnings. On the walls, lions move in a coordinated group, rhinoceroses confront one another beneath layered horns, horses appear in sequence, and bears occupy the stone with a confidence that feels planned rather than improvised. The artist did not merely trace familiar outlines, they selected surfaces, prepared them, combined engraving with charcoal, varied pressure and thickness, and used the pale limestone beneath darker marks to create contrast. What appears at first glance to be a single drawing often proves to be a carefully built event. This is the shock of Chauvet. Older theories of cultural development once encouraged a simple picture in which early art began as awkward marks and slowly advanced toward naturalism. Chauvet makes that sequence difficult to sustain. Its age does not show an art form learning to stand. It shows artists already controlling balance, rhythm, overlap, and visual emphasis. That does not mean no earlier experiments existed. The archaeological record is incomplete, and decorated surfaces exposed to weather may have vanished almost entirely. Nor does it prove that every person in Aurignacian Europe possessed the same abilities. It means only that by the time these images were made, some communities had already developed sophisticated visual traditions and the practical means to transmit them. The famous panel of the lions provides the clearest example. Several large felines face toward a group of bison. Their bodies overlap, yet their heads remain distinct. Parallel backs and repeated profiles create the sense of a coordinated advance. The animals are shown without the heavy manes familiar from modern male lions, a detail consistent with Ice Age cave lions as they are generally reconstructed. The scene can look narrative, almost like a hunt observed at close range. But caution is necessary. The arrangement may have been built across more than one visit, and the original viewers may not have understood it as a frozen episode. Under moving light, individual heads could appear separately, then merge into a group. The wall encouraged sequence without requiring a modern story. Nearby rhinoceroses are treated differently. Their horns, backs, and bellies are drawn through repeated contours. Some figures seem to occupy successive positions, giving the impression of movement or confrontation. One celebrated pair appears to face each other, their horns crossing the visual field. It is tempting to describe them as fighting, but the evidence remains incomplete. The multiple outlines may represent animation, correction, emphasis, several animals, or a combination of these. What matters is that the artist understood how repetition could make a body seem unstable and alive. The technical range is equally striking. Charcoal provided black pigment that could be applied directly or ground and spread. Red ochre was brushed, rubbed, dabbed, or blown onto the wall. Some surfaces were scraped clean before drawing, producing a brighter background. Lines were engraved with stone tools, sometimes reinforcing painted contours. Shading appears along flanks and heads, while smudging softened transitions. In places, the artist used the natural shape of the limestone to supply volume that no pigment alone could create. A convex surface became a shoulder, a hollow suggested an eye socket. A crack continued the direction of a leg or spine. These decisions required more than observation of animals. They required memory. The artist could not bring a rhinoceros, lion, or mammoth into the cave as a model. They worked from accumulated visual knowledge, perhaps supported by shared conventions and repeated practice on perishable surfaces or portable objects now lost. They knew which features made a species recognizable: the curve of a horn, the angle of a muzzle, the weight of a belly, the line connecting neck and shoulder. Some details are abbreviated, yet the animals remain immediately identifiable. Economy of line is not evidence of simplicity. It is often evidence of control. Chauvet's bestiary also complicates any direct link between painting and food. Lions, rhinoceroses, bears, mammoths, and other dangerous animals hold prominent positions, although these were not the ordinary foundation of human diet. Their importance on the wall may have arisen from danger, rarity, power, story, memory, or symbolic classification. Scholars still debate these possibilities. Hunting magic, once a dominant explanation for cave art, struggles to account for a decorated world so heavily populated by creatures people did not commonly pursue. Yet the failure of that simple theory does not identify a replacement religion. The cave itself organizes the animals. Earlier chambers contain many red figures, hand marks, and signs, while deeper zones feature increasingly dramatic black compositions. This pattern has encouraged interpretations of a planned symbolic journey. There may indeed be structure in the distribution, but it is difficult to determine whether the structure was conceived from the beginning or emerged as later visitors added images. The cave's long human history includes more than one period of use. A panel that appears unified today may combine choices separated by years, generations, or longer. Even within a composition, one hand cannot always be assumed. Differences in technique, scale, pigment, and execution suggest varied participation. Some artists were highly skilled, others may have followed existing forms, added marks, or worked within inherited conventions. The modern desire to identify a single master says more about later ideas of authorship than about Ice Age production. Chauvet may preserve collective tradition rather than personal signature. One lesser-known detail sharpens this point. Before some black drawings were made, artists scraped the wall, removing surface deposits and leaving a fresh pale field. This was not casual marking. It altered the cave physically to improve visibility and contrast. The prepared surface became part of the composition, much like priming a panel, though performed on ancient limestone deep underground. Such preparation required foresight, tools, time, and a clear expectation of what the finished image should accomplish. The mastery at Chauvet therefore lies not in resemblance alone. It lies in the coordination of material, surface, movement, placement, memory, and restricted light. The artist understood that an animal could be suggested by a few lines, made massive by a bulge in stone, multiplied through overlap, or animated by flame. They created images for conditions in which the viewer could never remain fully detached from the cave. Chauvet does not reveal the birth of art, and it should not be treated as the oldest art in the world. Earlier traditions survive elsewhere, and discoveries beyond Europe continue to push the record deeper. What Chauvet demonstrates is more precise and perhaps more profound by the early Upper Paleolithic in Europe. Visual culture was already capable of complexity, planning, and dramatic control. Its sophistication arrives without the comforting record of gradual apprenticeship. The beginning is missing, but mastery is present. Lascaux resists certainty in a way Chauvet often does not. Its fame encourages a neat date, a single moment when the walls were transformed, but the evidence refuses to cooperate. The cave contains pigments made from minerals, especially manganese compounds and iron oxides, and those materials do not carry the carbon needed for direct radiocarbon dating. A black horse can therefore be unmistakably prehistoric and still remain difficult to place within a precise year, century, or even narrow cultural phase. The age of the cave's human activity can be estimated from charcoal, lamps, tools, bones, and archaeological layers, but the age of every painted figure cannot simply be borrowed from the nearest dated object. This distinction sounds technical, yet it changes the entire story. A lamp may tell us that someone stood in a chamber at a certain time. A worked piece of bone may belong to one visit. A charcoal fragment may record another. None of them automatically proves that the red cow above, the the black sign beside it, and the engraved horse underneath were all created together. The cave may preserve a sequence rather than a single event, and what looks like one unified masterpiece may in fact be the result of multiple campaigns, additions, revisions, and returns. For decades, Lascaux was commonly placed around 17,000 years ago, often associated with the Magdalenian. More recent work has complicated that picture. Radiocarbon dating of archaeological material has pointed toward human activity around 21,500 to 21,000 calibrated years before present, while stylistic and technological arguments continue to connect parts of the decoration with the end of the Solutrean, the Badagulian, or the beginning of the Magdalenian. These labels are useful, but they are modern frameworks laid over incomplete evidence. Scholars still debate how tightly the paintings can be assigned, and no single date should be treated as if the entire cave were decorated in one season. Part of the problem lies in the black pigment itself. When black is made from charcoal, a direct date may be possible, because charcoal contains organic carbon. When black is made from manganese dioxide, it does not. For a long time, some Dordogne paintings thought to be mineral-based were considered beyond direct dating. Then chemical imaging revealed that certain dark layers contained carbon-based material hidden within or mixed with mineral pigment. Research at Font de Gaume and other sites has shown that apparently uniform black can be chemically complex. New techniques may therefore make some previously undatable paintings accessible to radiocarbon analysis. That development is important, but it does not solve Lascaux by association. A method successful in another cave cannot be assumed to produce dates here until the pigments themselves are sampled and shown to contain suitable carbon. Sampling also presents an ethical problem. Every test removes or alters some material, however small the amount. In a fragile site already marked by conservation crises, the desire for precision must be balanced against the risk of damaging the evidence one hopes to understand. Sometimes uncertainty is not a temporary failure of science. It is the responsible result of refusing to destroy what cannot be replaced. The instability of Lascaux's chronology also appears in the walls. Images overlap. Engravings cross painted areas. Signs sit beside animals in relationships that may be deliberate but are difficult to order. Some figures were applied over earlier marks, while others may have been retouched. The Hall of the Bulls, often experienced as a single overwhelming composition, has yielded evidence that different pigment mixtures were used in several stages. That suggests planning and sequence, perhaps even changing participation. The great chamber may have grown through time rather than appearing fully formed. This does not mean the cave was decorated randomly. The placement of animals, the repeated themes, and the control of scale point toward structured choices. Yet structure does not require simultaneity. A later visitor could respect an earlier composition, extend it, respond to it, or deliberately alter it. The cave may have functioned as a cumulative surface where memory remained visible. An addition did not necessarily erase what came before. It entered into conversation with it. Modern viewers tend to value the idea of an original finished work. Ice Age communities may not have shared that expectation. A wall could remain open to return. A familiar animal might be renewed. A sign might be added when a group revisited the chamber. Pigment could fade under mineral films and then be reinforced. The evidence remains incomplete. But the possibility of repeated engagement makes better sense of the cave than the image of a solitary painter completing everything at once. Dating difficulties also expose a deeper problem in archaeological reasoning. Objects found near one another are not always contemporary. Caves collect evidence vertically and horizontally. Water moves sediment. People disturb earlier layers. Animals enter. Mineral crusts form. Later visitors step across older surfaces. The apparent association between a tool and a painting may be meaningful, accidental, or the result of processes that unfolded over centuries. Chronology must therefore be built from many lines of evidence rather than one convenient match. Lascaux's unstable age is not a weakness in the site's importance. It is part of what makes the cave intellectually valuable. It forces researchers to separate observation from inference. The paintings are real, their Paleolithic origin is secure, their exact sequence, duration, and internal phases are less certain. That layered conclusion is stronger than a falsely precise date because it reflects what the evidence actually supports. There is also a human consequence. If Lascaux was created across more than one campaign, then different people may have encountered the cave as both artists and heirs. Some entered a chamber already marked by earlier hands. They did not begin with blank stone. They worked in the presence of images that may already have carried authority, memory, or expectation. The cave could have been ancient even to those who added its later signs. New analytical tools may eventually identify carbon hidden in pigments, distinguish mineral sources, or map the order of superimposed lines with greater confidence. They may narrow some dates and overturn others, but even the best methods will not transform every wall into a complete calendar. Some pigments may remain undatable. Some samples may be too contaminated. Some sequences may never be resolved without unacceptable damage. So Lascaux stands not as a single frozen moment, but as a problem of time made visible. Its animals appear immediate, yet their chronology is blurred. Its walls seem unified, yet they may preserve several episodes. The cave invites exact answers while withholding the conditions needed to provide them. That tension is not an obstacle to the mystery. It is the mystery a masterpiece whose age is known broadly, argued carefully, and still unstable at the level of the individual image. Time at Lascaux is difficult to isolate because the cave does not present its images on flat, passive walls. The stone itself interferes with every attempt to separate one act from another. A painted line may follow a ridge which formed millions of years before the artist arrived. A shoulder may be supplied by a bulge in the limestone. A muzzle may end at a crack that already resembled a mouth. What looks in a photograph like a distorted animal may appear balanced when seen from the narrow path where the viewer was expected to stand. The cave is not a container holding pictures. It is part of the machinery that makes them visible. This changes how the images must be understood. Modern reproductions flatten the wall, correct the lighting, and present the figure frontally. The result helps cataloguing but distorts the original experience. Many panels cannot be seen properly from directly in front. Some wrap around corners, others extend across ceilings or descend onto sloping surfaces. A horse may appear elongated in a photograph because its body was designed to compensate for the curvature of the stone. An aurochs may seem incomplete because the missing contour was never painted. The wall itself supplied it. Recent spatial research treats decorated caves as three-dimensional environments, not collections of isolated images. Digital mapping and virtual reconstruction reveal how figures relate to roots, obstacles, sightlines, and standing space. This work reveals that placement was often selective. An artist might choose a convex surface for the chest of a bison, a recessed area for the eye of a horse, or a low ceiling where the viewer has to crouch. These decisions shape the body of the image and the body of the observer at the same time. At Chauvet, the effect can be dramatic. Some animals seem to emerge from the wall because the artist used natural relief to create mass, scraping removed surface films and exposed paler limestone, increasing contrast around charcoal lines. In other areas, engravings catch oblique light and vanish when the lamp changes position. The image is conditional. It exists fully only through a particular combination of stone, viewpoint, and illumination. A person moving past it does not simply look at a picture. The person activates it. This relationship between viewer and surface has led some researchers to compare Paleolithic cave art with installation art. The comparison is modern and requires care, yet identifies something important. An installation occupies space and requires participation. Its meaning changes with movement, proximity, and sensory conditions. Ice Age artists also appear to have worked with topography, distortion, access, and sequence. They placed images where the viewer might approach from below, turn suddenly into a chamber, or see only fragments before the whole composition became legible. Natural forms may have suggested the first idea. Human vision readily finds animals, faces, and bodies in ambiguous surfaces. This tendency, called pareidolia, can turn a stain into an eye or a crack into the curve of a back. In a cave, where light is weak and shadows move, the effect becomes stronger. Ice Age artists may have recognized potential creatures already latent in the stone, then added only enough pigment or engraving to stabilize the form. A few lines could transform an accidental swelling into a living flank. Yet pareidolia cannot explain the entire process. Recognizing a suggestive shape is not the same as planning a complex panel, preparing pigment, carrying light, and returning to difficult chambers. The artist did not merely discover animals in the wall. They selected among countless possible forms and imposed conventions learned within their communities. One crack became meaningful while another was ignored. One bulge became a shoulder while another remained stone. The evidence suggests collaboration between perception and tradition. Lascaux offers striking examples of this collaboration. In the Hall of the Bulls, monumental bodies curve with the architecture. The animals are not arranged as a straight procession on a level band. They rise, overlap, and adapt to irregular surfaces. Their scale can overwhelm the viewer under limited light. Elsewhere, in narrower passages, the images respond to constrained space with smaller figures, engravings, or dense superimposition. The cave's changing geometry creates different visual conditions, perhaps supporting different actions or audiences, though scholars debate how intentional the sequence was. The need to adapt to the wall also reveals technical intelligence. Painting a large animal across a curved ceiling requires anticipation. The artist cannot step back easily to assess the whole figure. Light reaches only part of the surface. The body may be viewed from an awkward angle during execution. Proportions must be remembered while the painter moves along the wall, perhaps working from a raised support. The final image may look coherent from a viewing position unavailable during parts of its creation. That problem suggests rehearsal, experience, or shared procedures. Artists may have practiced on portable materials, exposed rock, hide, wood, or surfaces that have not survived. They may have used preliminary engravings, guide marks, or the natural geometry of the wall to maintain proportion. Some images show corrections and overlapping contours, evidence that the process was neither effortless nor mechanically perfect. Skill appears not as inspiration alone, but as controlled adjustment under difficult conditions. Three-dimensional analysis also complicates claims about hidden art. A figure may seem concealed on a plan but remain visible from an ancient route. Another may occupy a chamber reachable only by a few people at once. Accessibility exists on a spectrum. Some decorated zones invite collective viewing, others restrict posture, movement, and group size. These physical differences may have social meaning, but they do not automatically identify secret rights or privileged specialists. Practical constraints and symbolic choices can coexist. The cave surface also accumulated time. Mineral films formed before and after painting. Scraping could erase natural deposits. Later marks crossed earlier figures. Water altered some zones while leaving others untouched. The wall became a layered record in which geology, animals, humans, and microbes all contributed. A painted animal did not simply sit on ancient stone. It entered a surface already marked by deep time and continued changing after people left. Virtual reality now helps researchers test sightlines, lamp ranges, movement, and distortion without repeatedly entering fragile caves. These reconstructions are valuable because they restore relationships lost in flat photography. Still, no model perfectly recreates humidity, smell, bodily caution, uncertain footing, or the emotional pressure of darkness. Digital space can calculate where an image becomes visible, but not what that emergence meant. What survives suggests that Ice Age artists did not treat limestone as blank material. They read it. They followed its tensions, accepted some irregularities, corrected others, and allowed geology to complete bodies that pigment only began. The image and the cave cannot be cleanly separated. Each animal is partly drawn, partly carved, partly illuminated, and partly discovered in stone. The stone could suggest an animal, but suggestion alone could not make the Hall of the Bulls. To transform limestone into a field of bodies, Ice Age artists needed materials that behaved differently under weak light, adhered to uneven surfaces, and remained visible across distance. They brought iron-rich earths for reds and yellows, manganese compounds for deep blacks, charcoal for softer lines, and stone tools for engraving, scraping, and preparing the wall. Each substance had to be recognized, collected, transported, broken down, mixed, tested, and applied with methods suited to the cave. At Lascaux, mineral pigments dominate much of the decoration. Iron oxides produced red, orange, and yellow tones. Manganese minerals produced dense black. The raw material could be ground into powder and combined with liquid or used in a drier form, depending on the desired effect. Some pigments may have been rubbed directly onto the wall, others were applied with pads, brushes, fingers, or hollow tubes that allowed colour to be blown across the surface. Engraved lines sharpened contours where paint alone was insufficient. Scraping could lighten the wall or remove a surface film before pigment was added. The artist did not need a complicated chemical recipe, but they did need practical knowledge. A pigment that looked dark beside a hearth might behave differently on damp limestone. A mixture too thin could run. One too dry might fail to bind. Coarse particles could create texture, while fine powder produced smoother coverage. The wall itself changed from one zone to another, absorbing colour unevenly. Skill therefore included knowing not only how to draw an animal, but how matter would respond underground. Archaeologists compare mineral composition to possible geological sources, though such matches are not always precise. A useful black mineral was not merely a colour, it was a resource worth remembering, collecting, and perhaps carrying across a landscape already filled with essential loads. Every additional object brought into the cave competed with fuel, tools, food, and the need to keep hands free for difficult movement. Their choices also reveal that colour was planned before the descent began. Charcoal offered different possibilities. A charred stick could function as a drawing tool, producing immediate lines that could be smudged, thickened, or sharpened. Ground charcoal could be spread as pigment. Because it contained carbon, it also preserved the possibility of direct radiocarbon dating, though contamination and later contact complicate analysis. At Chauvet, charcoal was central to many black figures and to traces left by torches touching the walls. The same material could illuminate a passage, mark a route, draw an animal, and leave a datable residue. Its roles overlapped. Red imagery at Chauvet often reveals varied application. Fingers drew lines through pigment. Pads or brushes spread colour. Blowing created diffuse marks and hand stencils. A finger line records bodily contact with the wall. A sprayed field creates a clouded edge. A brush-like tool permits finer control. These differences may identify distinct gestures or stages of work, but they do not automatically identify individual artists. The same technique could serve several hands. Lascaux's Hall of the Bulls provides the strongest warning against imagining a single uninterrupted decorating event. Detailed analysis of tiny pigment samples suggests that the rotunda was built through at least 5 ornamentation steps. Different batches of colouring material were used at different moments. The sequence appears to include major animal figures, later additions, and signs placed into an already occupied composition. A black bear and a cross-like mark may belong to later interventions by different hands. The chamber that now seems visually unified may therefore preserve a history of decisions. This changes the meaning of authorship. The Great Rotunda was not necessarily conceived and completed by one exceptional painter working through a single season. It may have been an inherited space. One group established the dominant animals. Others returned, respected some forms, crossed others, inserted new signs, or reinforced what had begun to fade. The result resembles a layered tradition more than a signed masterpiece. 5 steps do not necessarily mean 5 individuals or 5 generations. A single campaign can involve several pigment mixtures. Separate visits can occur within days, years, or much longer spans. The samples come from a limited number of points, and the evidence remains incomplete. Still, the material variation is enough to undermine the simplest story of one artist, one plan, and one finished moment. The wall grew. That growth required negotiation with what was already there. Adding a figure to an empty surface is different from adding one beside an enormous aurochs. Earlier images constrain later choices. A new animal can align with an existing contour, fill an open space, challenge the scale of a predecessor, or deliberately overlap it. A sign can acquire meaning from its placement even when its original code is lost. Each intervention changes how the entire chamber is read. The tools behind these acts were often modest. Flint edges incised limestone, pigment crayons left direct strokes. Brushes may have been made from hair, plant fibre, or chewed material, though perishable tools rarely survive. Hollow bones or tubes could assist spraying, lamps, containers, grinding stones, and scaffolding components added to the working kit. The lack of elaborate equipment should not be confused with lack of technical sophistication. Complex results can emerge from simple tools when procedures are practiced and transmitted. There is also evidence of correction. Lines were redrawn, contours multiplied, a horn might be adjusted, a back strengthened, or an earlier mark absorbed into a later figure. These changes reveal process rather than failure. The artists evaluated what they had made under difficult light and modified it. Perfection was not achieved in a single gesture. It was built through observation, memory, and revision. Material study therefore brings the human presence closer than style alone. Pigment batches imply preparation. Superimposition implies sequence. Variations in application imply choices. The cave records not only finished animals but episodes of work, grinding, mixing, testing, climbing, waiting for smoke to clear, returning with more fuel, and deciding where the next line should go. What survives suggests organization, but not a rigid workshop in the modern sense. The Hall of the Bulls may have been renewed because the images mattered repeatedly, not once. Its makers may have understood completion as temporary. A chamber could remain open to addition, much as a story can be retold without becoming a different story. The mineral colours fixed gestures to the wall, yet the composition itself remained alive to later hands. Stone provided the forms, but charcoal and mineral made them social. They allowed one visit to speak to another. A line placed in darkness could become the condition for a future line, and a pigment mixture prepared thousands of years ago could preserve the evidence that the cave was not decorated in a single breath. The pigments, tools, and prepared surfaces of the previous chamber imply another material that rarely survives in the same visible way: light. Nothing could be drawn, engraved, mixed, or inspected in deep cave darkness without a controlled flame. Yet the light available to Ice Age artists was small, unstable, and expensive. It depended on fuel carried from outside, wicks that had to remain usable, torches that burned down, and fires that changed the air around them. Every image at Lascaux and Chauvet was made inside a narrow moving circle of visibility. Stone lamps found at Lascaux provide the clearest evidence. Shallow depressions in carved or selected stone held animal fat, with a fibrous wick drawing fuel toward the flame. Such lamps could produce a relatively steady light with less smoke than an open torch, making them useful for close work or prolonged activity. Their glow was not bright by modern standards. It illuminated a limited area, leaving the rest of the chamber in darkness. A painter standing beside one could see the surface in front of the hand, but not necessarily the full body of a large animal stretching across several meters. Torches solved a different problem. Bundles of resinous wood or branches could be carried through passages, raised to inspect ceilings, and moved quickly between chambers. Experimental archaeology shows that they produce stronger and more mobile illumination than grease lamps, but also flickered, shed embers, and released smoke. A torchbearer had to manage burning material while navigating uneven floors. The flame changed as the torch was turned, shortened, or replenished. Shadows jumped across the walls, and natural projections seemed to move. Small fireplaces may also have been used in some Paleolithic caves, creating broad pools of light for longer stays. They offered warmth and could illuminate a working area, but they required more fuel and produced heat, smoke, ash, and carbon dioxide. In confined spaces, ventilation became critical. A chamber that felt safe at the beginning of an activity could become uncomfortable or dangerous as combustion changed the air. The evidence remains incomplete, and not every blackened patch proves a deliberate lighting installation, but the physical limits of fire cannot be ignored. Experimental work helps reconstruct those limits. Researchers have built replicas of grease lamps, torches, and small hearths using plausible Paleolithic materials, then measured brightness, burn time, smoke, and mobility. The results show no universally superior system. Lamps are stable and efficient for stationary tasks. Torches are better for movement and broader visual scanning. Hearths can support group activity but anchor people to one location. Ice Age visitors probably selected among these systems according to the passage, duration, and purpose of the visit. The distinction matters for how the paintings were created. A large figure may have required one person to work while another managed the lamp. Pigment containers, tools, and fuel had to remain accessible without being stepped on in darkness. The artist might pause when smoke thickened or when the flame needed attention. A contour could be drawn in segments because only part of the wall was visible at once. The finished coherence of the animal therefore conceals a process interrupted by practical demands. Some surfaces were high enough to require climbing, temporary supports, or scaffolding. At Lascaux, sockets and other architectural clues have been interpreted as evidence that wooden structures helped artists reach elevated areas, though the precise form of those constructions is uncertain. If supports were used, they had to be assembled and navigated under restricted light. A person working above the floor depended on others to steady materials, manage flame, and preserve a safe route down. Monumental cave art was not simply a matter of individual talent. It could require coordinated labour. Chauvet preserves charcoal marks where torches touched or brushed the walls. These marks are easy to overlook beside the animal panels, yet they record movement with remarkable immediacy. Some may have served to refresh a torch by knocking away spent material. Others could have marked routes or resulted from accidental contact. They show that people carried fire through the cave and interacted physically with the stone beyond the formal drawings. The cave contains traces of navigation as well as representation. Light also controlled perception after the work was finished. In modern reproductions, panels are evenly illuminated and visible at once. Under Ice Age conditions, a lion's head might appear before its body. A rhinoceros could dissolve as the flame moved, while another emerged from an adjacent hollow. Repeated outlines, engraved lines, and natural relief would respond differently to changing angles. The animals may have seemed animated not because the wall itself moved, but because the illumination never stopped moving. This effect should not be overstated as prehistoric cinema. No evidence proves that artists designed every repeated limb or overlapping contour for deliberate animation. Some lines may be corrections, multiple individuals, or later additions. Yet it is equally misleading to imagine the images under museum lighting. Whatever their original purpose, they were experienced through flame, and flame made visibility intermittent. The body of the visitor also became part of the visual system. A raised lamp cast the viewer's shadow across the panel. A person approaching a chamber could block another's light. Smoke irritated the eyes and altered concentration. Heat gathered near flames while the surrounding cave remained cool. The smell of burning fat, wood, damp stone, and human presence shaped an environment unlike any modern gallery. These sensory conditions may have intensified attention, but they also imposed fatigue. Time underground was therefore measurable in fuel. A lamp could burn only while fat remained. A torch shortened visibly. Every descent carried a limit, even if reserve supplies were placed along the route. The group had to estimate how long the journey, work, and return would take. Losing the last flame was not an inconvenience. It meant total darkness, in which familiar distances disappeared and movement became hazardous. Knowledge of the cave reduced that danger, but never removed it. The A-Light project and related research now combine experimental systems, spatial data, and digital simulation to estimate what ancient visitors could see from particular points. These methods can calculate illuminated radius and probable movement, but they cannot recover intention. A narrow light cone may explain why a panel was approached in sequence. It cannot reveal whether the sequence taught a story, marked a ceremony, or simply followed the safest route. What survives suggests that underground image-making was both technically controlled and physically demanding. Artists worked around flame rather than beneath abundant light. They adapted tools, posture, timing, and cooperation to a visibility that was always partial. The darkness was not a blank condition defeated by fire. It remained present at the edge of every gesture, hiding most of the cave while allowing one animal at a time to come forward. The moving flame did more than reveal the animals. It changed them. A horse outlined in charcoal could appear still when the lamp was held close, then seem to turn as the light passed across the wall. A rhinoceros drawn with repeated horns and overlapping backs could occupy several positions in succession. Engraved lines invisible from one angle flashed into view from another. The cave never presented a fixed image. It offered a sequence assembled by the eye, the body, and the changing flame. This has encouraged comparisons with animation, with a distant prehistory of cinema. Such language is useful only if handled carefully. Ice Age artists did not possess film, projection, or a screen separated from the surrounding world. Their images were embedded in stone and activated by movement through space. Some figures show multiple legs, heads, or outlines that may indicate successive positions. Others may record corrections, additions by different hands, or several animals superimposed. No single explanation fully accounts for every repeated contour. Yet the visual result under flickering light could still create motion, whether or not motion was the sole intention. At Chauvet, the rhinoceroses provide some of the strongest examples. Their bodies overlap in dense black lines, and their horns multiply across the panel. Under steady illumination, the composition can look crowded. Under a moving torch, however, only parts of it become prominent at once. One head appears, then another. A line interpreted as a correction may function perceptually as a second position. The viewer does not need to believe that the artist invented animation in that sense to recognize that they understood how repetition could make an animal seem unstable. The lions work through a different rhythm. Their profiles advance in parallel, their heads align toward bison. The group feels coordinated because the eye reads the repeated forms as phases of collective movement. A lamp held low would emphasize muzzles and foreheads before bodies, allowing the animals to gather gradually out of darkness. The wall creates no single instant, it creates expectation. Lascaux also contains figures whose duplicated limbs or altered contours have been interpreted as attempts to represent movement. Horses bend, stags overlap, and large bodies curve across surfaces that cannot be absorbed at one glance. Some animals seem to change direction as the observer walks. The effect depends not only on painted lines but on the route through the cave. A viewer approaches, turns, lowers the head, raises the flame, and reconstructs the body across several moments. Perception unfolds temporally even when the pigment remains still. This temporal quality may help explain why certain figures were placed where a photograph struggles to make sense of them. A distorted animal can become coherent from a particular point on the ancient path. A body stretched around a curve can appear to pass across the wall as the viewer moves. Researchers studying Paleolithic installation art have argued that topography, distortion, participation, and changing viewpoint should be treated as part of the work. The image is not merely what was painted, it is what happened when someone encountered it. Sound intensified the encounter. In deep chambers, a small sound can feel detached from its source. A footstep returns from a wall that cannot be seen. A voice grows fuller beneath one ceiling and disappears beneath another. The cave is acoustically uneven, just as it is visually uneven. Some decorated cave locations have been associated with strong resonance, encouraging the idea that image and sound were deliberately linked. Research into cave acoustics has produced intriguing patterns, but the conclusions remain limited. In some sites, panels cluster near places where echoes or resonance are noticeable. Initial acoustic studies at Chauvet are beginning to map how sound behaves within its chambers. These findings support the possibility that ancient visitors noticed and used acoustic differences. They do not prove that every painted zone was selected for music, chanting, or formal ritual. People without electronic amplification would have been sensitive to natural reverberation, because sound was essential for orientation and communication underground. A voice in the cave could do more than carry information. It could make a chamber feel inhabited beyond the visible group. A clap might return as several responses. A low tone could vibrate in the chest. A whisper might remain intimate in one passage and expand unexpectedly in another. These effects require no supernatural interpretation, but they could acquire social or symbolic importance. The people who knew the cave also knew where sound changed. The relationship between sound and image may have been practical. A resonant wall could help mark a location in darkness. A call could coordinate movement between people carrying lamps, pigments, and tools. Rhythm might support collective action, yet it may also have shaped memory. A particular animal panel associated with a distinctive echo would be easier to recall as an event rather than as a static visual object. Music is possible, but direct evidence is scarce. Paleolithic people elsewhere made flutes and sound-producing objects, and the human voice required no artifact to survive. Still, no instrument found beside a panel automatically proves performance there, and no resonance measurement recovers a vanished song. The cave could have hosted spoken stories, calls, breath, silence, or activities that modern categories divide too sharply. Silence itself mattered. When several people stopped moving, the cave could become so quiet that breathing and flame seemed enlarged. In that condition, the sudden emergence of an animal from the wall would carry unusual force. The experience may have heightened attention, but heightened attention is not evidence of trance. Altered states, shamanic journeys, and ritual theatre remain among the competing interpretations of cave art, yet they should not be treated as automatic explanations for sensory intensity. The strongest conclusion is simple. Ice Age images were made and seen in an environment where light and sound behaved. The artist knew this environment through bodily experience. They understood that charcoal absorbed light, scraped limestone reflected it, engraving appeared under a bleak illumination, and curved stone altered shadows. They also knew where voices carried and where steps changed tone. Whether these effects served ritual, teaching, memory, or several purposes at once remains unresolved. Modern museum lighting freezes the animals into compositions. The ancient cave released them in fragments. A lion advanced because its head appeared before its flank. A rhinoceros shifted because one horn vanished as another emerged. A horse seemed to breathe because flame moved across a swelling in the stone. Sound gathered around these appearances, echoing or dying away. What survives is not a prehistoric film and not a silent gallery. It is a set of images built for conditions in which perception was always changing. The animals moved because the viewers moved, because the fire moved, because the cave returned sound from darkness, and because the human mind joined separate glimpses into living forms. The animals that seem to move in the cave are not a simple catalogue of the creatures Ice Age people ate. That mismatch is one of the most important clues on the walls. If the paintings were merely a record of daily subsistence, the bestiary should resemble the contents of hearths, camps, and butchered bones. It does not. At Lascaux, horses dominate, followed by aurochs, bison, deer, and smaller numbers of ibex and other animals. Reindeer, although economically important in many Upper Paleolithic communities, are strikingly scarce. At Chauvet, the imbalance is even more dramatic. Lions, rhinoceroses, bears, and mammoths occupy major panels, while species more routinely hunted do not control the imagery. The wall and the meal belong to different systems of selection. This does not mean subsistence was irrelevant. Hunters knew animal anatomy because their lives depended on it. They watched gait, season, sex, condition, migration, and behavior. The precision of many images comes from sustained observation, not fantasy alone. Yet observation did not dictate which animals deserved a place underground. A species could be common in the landscape and nearly absent from the cave. Another could be dangerous, rarely approached, and visually central. At Lascaux, the horse is the most frequent animal, appearing in varied scales, postures, and techniques. Horses were familiar inhabitants of the open Ice Age landscape, and their bones occur at archaeological sites across the region. Their abundance on the walls may reflect ecological importance, social memory, aesthetic preference, symbolic classification, or several of these at once. The evidence does not allow a single motive. What it does show is that repetition was meaningful. The artist returned to the horse form again and again, preserving differences in head shape, body proportion, coat marking, and movement. The great cattle carry another kind of force. Aurochs were immense wild bovines, powerful enough to be dangerous even to coordinated hunters. In the Hall of the Bulls, their scale exceeds the natural size of many surrounding animals. One black bull stretches across the curved wall with a body so large that it dominates the chamber. This exaggeration may have expressed importance, but importance is not the same as worship. Monumental scale can signal danger, prestige, narrative emphasis, spatial necessity, or the desire to overwhelm the viewer. At Chauvet, the prominence of predators and other formidable animals shifts the emotional register. Cave lions appear in groups. Woolly rhinoceroses gather in dense compositions. Bears occupy both imagery and the physical archaeology of the cave. Mammoths, panthers, and hyenas also enter the visual record. These were not ordinary prey animals. Some were competitors, threats, scavengers, or powerful presences encountered at a distance. Their representation may have allowed people to think about forces that could not be controlled through ordinary hunting. The cave bear is especially complicated because it existed in the chamber before and during periods of human visitation. Bones cover parts of the floor. Claw marks remain on walls. Hollows show where bears nested. The painted bear, therefore, was not simply an image imported from the outer landscape. It referred to an animal whose bodily traces surrounded the visitors underground. The cave itself carried evidence of the creature. When people drew bears there, they worked within a space already marked by bear presence, though scholars still debate what relationship, if any, linked the animal remains to human symbolic activity. Early interpretations often explained cave art through hunting magic. According to this view, Drawing an animal helps secure success over it, control its spirit, or rehearse its capture. The theory seemed plausible because many images depict game species and because hunting was essential to survival. But the mismatch between art and diet weakened the idea that one rule governed everything. Predators at Chauvet, missing reindeer at Lascaux, and the rarity of clear hunting scenes resist a simple economic formula. The rejection of simple hunting magic does not prove that hunting had no symbolic role. Animals could matter because they were pursued, feared, followed, avoided, remembered, or woven into seasonal knowledge. A horse might be food in one context and an ancestor, category, omen, teaching device, or story figure in another. Modern societies also assign different meanings to the same species across meals, myths, emblems, and personal memory. There is no reason to assume Ice Age classification was less complex. The animals may also have organized social knowledge. Their appearances could have marked group identity, places, seasons, alliances, or narratives shared during gatherings. Certain species may have stood for relationships rather than for themselves. Structuralist interpretations later proposed that paired or opposed animals and signs formed a coded system across caves. Such approaches drew attention to placement and association, but often risked imposing consistency where the record is variable. No universal grammar has been demonstrated. Another possibility is that some images preserved ecological information, coat patterns, herd behavior, pregnancy, aggression, and seasonal traits can be represented visually. Recent debates over marks placed beside animal figures ask whether some signs recorded breeding cycles or seasonal events. The idea is intriguing, but statistical and interpretive problems remain. Even if a subset of signs stored practical information, the animals themselves cannot be reduced to field notes. Their scale, location, overlap, and restricted visibility suggest functions beyond ordinary reference. The rarity of landscape is equally revealing. The caves contain almost no painted horizons, rivers, trees, or weather. Animals float without ground lines. Their world is not represented as a complete outdoor scene. Stone replaces landscape, a crack becomes terrain, a bulge becomes flesh, and darkness removes the surrounding environment. The animal is isolated, intensified, and detached from the ordinary world in which it lived. This isolation may have helped turn familiar creatures into categories of thought. A horse on the steppe is one animal among many. A horse appearing alone from a cave wall becomes something else: memory, presence, pattern, perhaps a participant in a story. Yet modern language risks making the image more mystical than the evidence permits. The safest conclusion is that selection transformed animals from ecological neighbours into culturally organised forms. Lascaux contains roughly 600 animal figures, but only one unmistakably human-like figure in the famous shaft scene. Chauvet similarly grants overwhelming visual space to animals, while human representation remains rare and partial. The caves are therefore not portraits of human society in any direct sense. They are human-made environments in which humans largely remove their own bodies from view. That absence sharpens the bestiary's mystery. People carried the light, prepared the pigment, chose the walls, and controlled access. Yet they gave visual priority to other species. The painted world is not nature untouched by humanity. It is nature selected, edited, enlarged, repeated, and reorganized by human minds. What survives suggests that animals were more than dinner, but the precise language of that more has been lost. The animals dominate the caves, but they do not stand alone. Around them appear dots, bars, branching marks, rectangles, clusters of lines, repeated signs, and occasional hand traces. Some are small enough to miss beside the great bodies of bulls and lions. Others occupy deliberate positions near heads, flanks, or empty stretches of wall. Yet their recurrence across Paleolithic sites suggests that at least some belong to shared conventions rather than private improvisation. At Lascaux, signs take many forms. There are rows of dots, short strokes, angular figures, quadrilateral shapes, and marks often described with modern labels such as claviforms or tectiforms. Those labels classify shape. They do not translate meaning. A rectangle is not necessarily a house, a trap, a calendar, or a map. The temptation to rename an unknown sign after a familiar object can create the illusion of understanding. The safer observation is that certain forms recur, sometimes in association with particular animals or locations, and were recognizable enough to be reproduced. Chauvet contains its own symbolic field. Red dots, hand stencils, palm prints, and geometric marks occur alongside animals and natural wall features. One individual appears to have left repeated red palm impressions in several parts of the cave, perhaps using pigment on the hand and pressing against the limestone. Researchers have compared the dimensions and placement of these marks to identify recurring gestures, though assigning them to one person remains an inference. Unlike an animal drawn from memory, a hand impression records direct contact between skin, pigment, and stone. A hand stencil works differently. Pigment is blown around the hand, leaving a negative silhouette when the hand is removed. The body disappears, but its absence becomes the image. Such marks are among the most widespread forms of rock art in the world, appearing far beyond Western Europe. They can indicate presence, identity, participation, counting, affiliation, or purposes modern categories do not capture. The geometric signs raise a more difficult question. Could some have stored information? Recent research has examined whether Upper Paleolithic people combined signs in systematic ways that increased informational density. If particular marks were used repeatedly under similar conditions, they may have functioned as conventions understood by members of a community. Convention does not require writing. A trail marker, tally, emblem, or seasonal notation can communicate without representing spoken language word by word. This distinction matters because the phrase-first writing is too strong. Writing ordinarily encodes language through a stable system of signs that can reproduce words, grammatical relationships, or extended statements. No evidence shows that the marks at Lascaux or Chauvet operated at that level. They may have been mnemonic devices, labels, counts, categories, or prompts for information delivered orally. A sign could activate a remembered story without containing the story itself. One influential proposal argued that sequences of dots and strokes placed near animals recorded seasonal information, particularly reproductive cycles, and that a recurring Y-shaped sign marked birth. The idea attracted attention because it offered a testable interpretation rather than a vague appeal to ritual. It suggested that Ice Age people maintained a phenological calendar based on animal behavior. Such knowledge would have been practical in mobile societies attentive to migration, mating, and birthing seasons. The proposal remains debated. Critics have questioned how signs were selected, grouped, and assigned numerical value. A result can appear significant if ambiguous marks are included or excluded in ways that favor the hypothesis. Associations between species and seasons may also depend on modern ecological assumptions that do not perfectly match Ice Age conditions. Later evaluations have shown that the statistical foundation is not yet secure enough to call the system a demonstrated calendar. The hypothesis remains interesting, but no single explanation fully accounts for the variation. Another recent line of research focuses less on decoding individual signs and more on mapping their structure. If certain marks repeatedly cluster with particular animals, objects, or spatial zones, that pattern may reveal rules of placement even when semantic content remains unknown. Archaeologists can ask whether signs are random, whether some combinations are avoided, or whether particular forms become common during specific periods. This approach resembles studying the grammar of an unread language without knowing its vocabulary. Even here, caution is necessary, or caves were decorated over long spans. Images overlap. Later visitors may have added signs beside earlier animals. Preservation is uneven, and researchers inherit classifications created by previous scholars. Two marks grouped as the same sign may not have been equivalent to their makers. Conversely, forms that look different to modern eyes may have belonged to one category. The archaeological record preserves output but not the rules by which Ice Age people recognize similarity. Signs also interact with the cave surface. A dot placed inside a hollow may differ from the same dot on a flat wall. A line following a crack could emphasize a natural feature rather than encode an abstract symbol. Some marks may have guided movement, indicated where to stand, or identified locations that mattered because of sound, relief, or access. Others may be remnants of pigment testing, torch contact, or unfinished work. Not every mark was necessarily symbolic. Yet repeated forms across distant sites make pure accident unlikely. Upper Paleolithic communities exchanged tools, ornaments, techniques, and perhaps stories over wide networks. Signs could travel through those networks as part of a visual repertoire. Their persistence would require teaching. Someone had to know how a form should be made, where it belonged, and what response it was expected to produce. Even if the meaning changed through time, the convention itself could survive. This possibility brings memory into the cave. A compact mark can carry more than it visibly contains when viewers share background knowledge. A few lines may cue a route, a season, a social group, an animal category, or a narrative episode. The information lies partly in the sign and partly in the trained mind. Without the cultural context, modern viewers see only shape. The hand marks make that loss especially clear. They seem personal, almost like signatures, yet they may not express individual authorship. A hand could certify participation, mark a stage in an activity, identify a group, or repeat a gesture whose meaning belonged to ceremony. The modern instinct to read each print as someone saying "I was here" may be correct in part, but it is still an interpretation. What survives suggests that Ice Age visual culture included more than representation. It combined animals, marks, surfaces, gestures, and perhaps structured information. The caves may have stored knowledge, but not in a form that can be read independently of the people who made it. Their signs remain suspended between image and language, familiar enough to imply order and distant enough to resist translation. They show that something was being organized, remembered, or communicated. They do not tell us exactly what. The animals and signs fill the caves so that the human figure becomes conspicuous through absence. At Lascaux, hundreds of animals occupy the walls, yet only one unmistakably human-like figure appears in the shaft scene. At Chauvet, human presence is reduced to hands, partial bodies, and composite forms. The makers are everywhere in the evidence, but almost nowhere in the imagery. Their bodies enter as traces, fragments, and substitutions rather than as full portraits. This imbalance was deliberate, or at least culturally patterned. Ice Age artists were fully capable of observing and representing human anatomy. Portable figurines, engraved objects, hand stencils, and occasional human forms elsewhere in Upper Paleolithic art show that the subject was not beyond their technical ability. The scarcity of complete human figures cannot be explained by lack of skill. Something about representing people seems to have followed different conventions from representing horses, cattle, lions, or rhinoceroses. The shaft scene at Lascaux is the central puzzle. It lies in a difficult lower space reached by descending from the main decorated zones. On the wall, a bison appears with its body opened by a long mark, a rhinoceros stands nearby, and a simplified human figure lies or leans between them. The person has a bird-like head or mask, an erect body, and hands rendered with only a few fingers. A bird-shaped object sits close by, often interpreted as a staff, spear thrower, or ritual implement. A long line crosses the composition, while the animals and human occupy an arrangement unlike the more isolated figures elsewhere in the cave. The scene has generated many explanations. It has been described as a hunting accident, a myth, a shamanic vision, a symbolic death and transformation, a narrative sequence, or a collection of images not originally intended as one event. None of these readings is secure. The apparent wound on the bison may be an anatomical feature, a weapon, or a later line. The human posture may indicate falling, lying down, trance, or simply a schematic convention. The bird-headed appearance may represent a mask, a stylized face, or an image whose category is no longer recoverable. Modern viewers naturally turn the arrangement into a story because the elements seem connected. A dangerous animal, a human body, and a long object invite cause and effect. Yet the wall does not provide a beginning or ending. The rhinoceros may belong to another phase. The bird object may not be a staff. The figure may not represent a literal event at all. What survives in the record suggests a deliberate association, but the evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for every detail. The difference in style matters. Animals at Lascaux are often modelled with flowing contours, careful proportions, and confident movement. The human figure in the shaft is reduced to straight limbs, a narrow torso, and a sharply simplified head. This contrast once encouraged the idea that Ice Age artists could draw animals realistically but not people. That conclusion misunderstands convention. A schematic human may have been intentional because human identity was expressed through posture, costume, mask, or symbolic attributes rather than anatomical likeness. At Chauvet, the human body is similarly partial. One image combines a woman's lower body with the head or forequarters of a bison. The composition appears on a pendant-like projection of rock, and is sometimes called the Venus and the Sorcerer. Both names carry interpretive baggage. Venus is a modern archaeological label applied broadly to Paleolithic female imagery, while Sorcerer assumes a ritual identity that cannot be demonstrated. The figures may overlap because they were conceived together, because one was added later, or because the rock form encouraged a composite reading. The female body is represented mainly by the pubic triangle, legs, and lower torso, while the upper body is absent or merged with the animal form. This partiality may have been meaningful. It could emphasize sex, fertility, transformation, ancestry, or a category that does not correspond to modern ideas of personhood, yet such interpretations remain speculative. The image demonstrates that human and animal forms could be combined, not why they were combined. Handprints and stencils offer another way people entered the cave without becoming portraits. A hand is unmistakably human, but it reveals almost nothing about the face, status, or biography of its maker. It records scale, gesture, and contact. In some caves, missing finger segments in stencils have inspired theories involving injury, cold damage, ritual removal, or deliberate finger bending. Many researchers now emphasize that folded fingers can create similar shapes without bodily loss. The warning is relevant here. A trace of the body should not be turned into a dramatic biography without evidence. The rarity of complete people may reflect restrictions on representation. Perhaps animals were suitable for public or collective imagery, while human likenesses were socially sensitive. Perhaps human figures belonged mainly to portable media, body decoration, masks, clothing, or performances that did not survive. Perhaps identity was understood relationally, through animals, signs, and gestures rather than through individual faces. These possibilities remain open because preservation favors mineral pigment and engraved stone while erasing hide, wood, fiber, and painted skin. It is also possible that some apparent animals carried human associations now invisible to us. A lion may have represented more than a lion. A composite figure may not indicate transformation, but a category in which human and animal qualities were never sharply separated. Modern thought often divides nature, society, and religion into distinct fields. Ice Age communities may have organized experience differently. The images resist interpretation partly because the conceptual boundaries behind them are missing. Still, the absence should not be romanticized as proof of humility before nature or a lost ecological spirituality. Those ideas may appeal to modern concerns, but the caves do not confirm them. Human beings controlled the lamps, selected the animals, prepared the walls, and decided who entered. The visual dominance of animals was itself a human construction. People removed their own likeness while arranging the rest of life around culturally chosen forms. The rare human figures therefore stand at the edge of recognition. They are not portraits in the modern sense, and they do not explain themselves. The shaft figure, the partial female body, the hand stencil, and the composite creature each reveal a different way of being present without becoming fully visible. They suggest that the Ice Age image of a person was governed by rules unlike those applied to animals. The caves preserve human intelligence everywhere and human anatomy almost nowhere. That contradiction may be one of their deepest clues. The makers did not disappear from the walls by accident. They entered indirectly through touch, mask, fragment, sign, and animal form, leaving modern viewers to confront a possibility both simple and unsettling. Perhaps the human self they wished to represent was not meant to stand alone. The human figure may be rare on the walls, but the human hand is everywhere in the control of line. A horse drawn across a curved surface, a lion placed within a dense panel, or a rhinoceros built from overlapping contours required more than the ability to recognize an animal. It required trained movement. The artist had to control pressure, direction, speed, and proportion while working against rough stone, uncertain footing, and limited light. The finished image preserves not only what the maker saw, but what the maker could do. Recent research on motor skill in Paleolithic art has attempted to examine that competence by studying line continuity, curvature, hesitation, correction, and the coordination required by particular strokes. Researchers can ask whether some figures reflect practiced expertise rather than casual marking. The results do not identify named individuals, but they do suggest differences in mastery. Some contours are fluid and economical, made with the confidence of someone who knew how the line should end before it began. Others are more tentative, corrected, or technically uneven. The caves may preserve artists at different levels of experience. That variation matters because it points toward learning. No person develops complex visual control in isolation. Observation alone is not enough. A young or inexperienced maker must discover how pigment behaves, how a tool grips the wall, how a body can be reduced to a few decisive contours, and how distortion changes on curved stone. Those skills could have been taught through demonstration, imitation, correction, and repeated practice. Most practice surfaces have vanished. Hide, bark, wood, sand, skin, and exposed rock leave little trace compared with protected limestone. The cave may therefore preserve the mature result while hiding the long process that produced it. Training need not have resembled a formal school. Knowledge can pass through participation. One person grinds pigment while another draws. A novice watches how a hand follows a crack, how a torch is positioned, or how a horse's head is built from a small number of lines. Later, the learner adds a simple mark, renews a contour, or works in a less prominent zone. Over time, repeated participation becomes competence. What survives suggests cultural transmission, but the evidence remains incomplete, and no single pattern of apprenticeship can be demonstrated. The organization of a major decorated chamber also exceeds drawing skill. Materials had to be collected in advance. Fuel had to be prepared. Routes had to be known. Elevated surfaces may have required supports. Working groups had to coordinate movement without contaminating pigment, extinguishing lamps, or obstructing one another. Even if only one person made a particular contour, the act may have depended on several others. The solitary genius is possible in small episodes, but it is an inadequate model for the cave as a whole. This does not prove the existence of professional artists. Some researchers have proposed specialists, ritual experts, or socially recognized masters because the best images show exceptional control. Yet specialization exists on a spectrum. A person may be highly skilled without working exclusively as an artist. Seasonal mobility, hunting, toolmaking, childcare, food processing, and social obligations likely required flexible roles. An accomplished image maker could also have participated fully in other parts of community life. Differences between panels may reflect different hands, different generations, or different conventions rather than simple ranks of talent. A schematic figure is not automatically the work of a beginner. Simplification can be intentional. A repeated sign may demand precision of another kind. An engraved line made in a narrow passage may look less fluid because the body position was constrained. Technical judgment must therefore account for context before assigning skill. The caves also imply choices about audience. Some panels occupy chambers capable of holding several people. Others lie in spaces where only one or two individuals could work or view comfortably. This spatial variation may have structured learning. Open zones could support collective demonstration, while restricted areas may have involved experienced participants. Yet the physical capacity of a chamber does not reveal its social rules. A large room is not necessarily public, and a narrow passage is not necessarily secret. Wider archaeological patterns suggest that cave art belonged to social networks rather than isolated bands. Similar animal conventions, ornaments, tools, and signs occur across regions separated by distance. Such similarities can arise through movement, exchange, intermarriage, gatherings, and transmission. Communities may have met seasonally, shared techniques, and carried visual traditions between valleys. A convention did not need to remain identical to remain recognizable. It could change as it traveled. This wider network helps explain how sophisticated practices survived beyond one generation. A skill held by a single individual is fragile. A tradition distributed across groups is more resilient. People could compare styles, borrow methods, and reinforce common forms. At the same time, local caves preserve distinctive choices. Chauvet's predators and Lascaux's monumental cattle show that transmission did not erase variation. Shared visual capacity supported different cultural worlds. Figure recognition research adds another layer. Viewers trained within a tradition may have seen incomplete or distorted forms more quickly than outsiders. A few lines that seem ambiguous today could have been immediately legible to Ice Age observers familiar with the convention. Visual expertise belongs not only to the maker but to the audience. The community learned how to see. That shared seeing may explain why natural relief could be used so effectively. An untrained observer might notice only a bulge. Someone familiar with a visual tradition might recognize the beginning of a bison shoulder and understand how 3 added lines completed it. The cave then became a collaborative field between geology, artist, and culturally prepared viewer. Meaning depended on recognition. Collective activity deep underground is documented at other prehistoric sites, where groups entered difficult spaces and left organized traces. Such comparisons show that coordinated cave use was possible, but they do not prove that Lascaux or Chauvet functioned in the same way. Each site requires its own evidence. Still, the logistical demands of these caves make some degree of cooperation difficult to avoid. The question then is not only who could draw like this, but who made such drawing possible. Behind every assured contour stood remembered animals, transmitted methods, gathered pigments, protected flame, and people who knew the route. Some makers were likely more skilled than others. Some may have held special authority. Others may have learned through participation. The caves preserve no signatures, no biographies, and no list of roles. What they preserve is a social achievement disguised as individual gesture. One hand drew the line, but many conditions trained that hand, supplied it, guided it underground, and taught others how to recognize what appeared. The artists remain anonymous because authorship was never recorded in a form that survived. Their expertise endures, while the names, relationships, and institutions that sustained it have disappeared. Once skill, cooperation, and inherited convention are restored to the picture, the question of meaning becomes harder rather than easier. A technically accomplished image does not explain why it was made. A chamber organized through effort, planning, and social memory does not identify the belief that justified that effort. For more than a century, scholars have tried to supply the missing system. Each explanation has illuminated part of the caves, and each has left important evidence outside its frame. One of the earliest influential ideas was art for art's sake. According to this view, Paleolithic people made images because observation, pleasure, display, and creative satisfaction were already human capacities. The theory had the virtue of taking the artist seriously, rather than treating every mark as crude superstition. It also resisted the assumption that practical societies could not value beauty. Yet it struggles with the location of the work. Some images lie in deep, difficult spaces where casual decoration would have required extraordinary inconvenience. Beauty may have mattered, but beauty alone does not explain restricted access, repeated signs, or the careful use of underground topography. Hunting magic offered a more functional answer. If depicting an animal helped control it, attract it, weaken it, or ensure a successful hunt, then the caves became instruments of survival. The theory seemed to fit wounded figures and the central place of animals in Ice Age life, but the painted bestiary does not mirror the diet. Chauvet elevates lions, rhinoceroses, bears, and mammoths. Lascaux nearly excludes reindeer despite their economic importance. Clear hunting scenes are rare, and many animals show no sign of attack. Hunting may have entered some images, but it cannot carry the whole system. Structuralist approaches shifted attention from isolated figures to relationships. André Leroy-Gourhan and others studied the placement of species and signs across chambers, proposing that animals formed patterned oppositions or complementary categories. Horses and bovines, male and female principles, central and peripheral zones, entrances and depths were treated as elements of an organized symbolic structure. This approach helped demonstrate that cave walls were not random collections. It encouraged mapping, comparison, and analysis of composition. Yet broad structural schemes can become too elegant. Caves vary, chronologies overlap, and ambiguous signs can be forced into categories that produce the pattern expected. Shamanic interpretation became another powerful model. Deep caves, altered sensory conditions, composite beings, rare human figures, and geometric marks were compared with trance experiences and ritual practices documented in some historic societies. Darkness, echo, fatigue, and flickering light can indeed affect perception. Certain visual forms resemble patterns people report during altered states, but analogy is not proof. Communities separated by tens of thousands of years and vast cultural distances cannot be treated as interchangeable. There is no direct evidence that the artists of Lascaux or Chauvet were shamans in the ethnographic sense, and the term may conceal more than it explains. Mythological interpretations avoid some of that specificity. They suggest that the caves preserve the episodes from stories, origin accounts, animal ancestors, transformations, or relationships between visible and invisible worlds. The shaft scene at Lascaux and the composite imagery at Chauvet seem especially compatible with narrative or myth. Yet a modern viewer can generate many plausible stories from the same arrangement, without words, sequence, or an independent tradition. The difference between a mythic scene and a symbolic association remains uncertain. The caves may also have supported ritual performance without belonging to one fixed religion. People could have entered to mark transitions, renew group bonds, transmit knowledge, remember the dead, negotiate identity, or repeat seasonal acts. Ritual is a broad category for formalized behavior, and that breadth makes it both useful and dangerous. Almost any repeated underground activity can be called ritual after practical explanations weaken. The label should describe evidence, not replace it. Social memory offers another route. Decorated chambers may have acted as durable reference points where communities return to reaffirm stories, roots, alliances, or ancestral claims. New images could be added beside old ones, making the cave an archive whose authority grew through repetition. This possibility fits evidence for multiple campaigns and cultural transmission. It also explains why exact verbal content could change while the place retained significance. Still, memory does not specify what was remembered. Territorial marking has been proposed as well. Caves could anchor groups to landscapes, signal presence, or define relationships with important valleys and resources. But many deep images were not visible to strangers passing outside. If they marked territory, they did so for people who already knew how to find and enter them. The territory may have been social or cosmological, rather than defensive in the ordinary sense. Teaching remains plausible in certain contexts. Animal forms, seasonal signs, routes, and shared stories could be demonstrated underground, where attention was focused and distraction limited. Experienced people may have guided others through sequences of images, yet no panel can be identified confidently as a lesson, and the effort of reaching some zones exceeds what basic practical instruction required. Teaching may have occurred, but not necessarily as the primary reason for decoration. Religion, performance, memory, instruction, and identity are not mutually exclusive. A single gathering can teach, commemorate, initiate, and entertain at once. A ceremony could be aesthetically powerful, politically useful, emotionally intimate, and practically instructive at the same time, while participants themselves may never have divided those effects into separate named purposes. Modern categories separate functions that prehistoric communities may have combined. The same panel could change meaning across generations. An animal first painted within one tradition might later become part of another. A sign could remain recognizable after its original explanation faded. Differences between Chauvet and Lascaux make a universal theory even less likely. They are separated by more than 10,000 years, distinct animal emphases, different technical histories, and changing Ice Age societies. Other decorated caves add further variation. Some contain hand stencils, others dense engravings, others sparse red marks, and many have no monumental compositions at all. Cave art may be one modern name for several practices that were never unified in the minds of their makers. The best interpretation then may be a disciplined refusal to collapse diversity into one answer. This does not mean meaning is forever beyond study. Spatial patterns, pigment sequences, acoustics, access, animal selection, and sign distribution can eliminate weak claims and strengthen limited ones. Archaeology can show how images were made, where they were placed, and how sites changed. It can identify recurring conventions and expose modern projections. What it cannot yet provide is a translation. Every explanation leaves something out because the surviving evidence is material, while the missing system was social, spoken, remembered, and lived. The caves are not meaningless, just they are densely meaningful. The problem is that their meanings were carried by people, and the people left no key. The meanings may be lost, but the walls themselves are not beyond danger. Lascaux's modern history has become a warning that preservation is not passive. Once the cave opened to large numbers of visitors, the stable environment that had protected the paintings began to change. Human breath raised carbon dioxide and humidity. Electric lighting altered temperature and encouraged biological growth. Dust and microorganisms entered on clothing and shoes. The cave did not simply receive an audience, it received a new climate. Closing Lascaux in 1963 slowed the damage, but it did not return the cave to an untouched state. Conservation teams confronted algae, fungi, bacterial communities, mineral changes, and later the black stains that appeared across parts of the interior. Treatments intended to remove one threat sometimes disturbed the ecological balance and created conditions for another. Mechanical cleaning could reduce visible growth while reshaping the microscopic community living on the stone. The lesson was uncomfortable. A cave is not an empty container with paintings attached. It is an ecosystem. An intervention can move instability from one form to another. Recent metagenomic work has allowed researchers to identify communities associated with Lascaux's dark stains. Such analysis may help distinguish active threats from harmless presence, but it does not offer a simple cure. Microorganisms interact with moisture, minerals, airflow, previous chemical treatments, and one another. Removing them completely is neither realistic nor necessarily desirable. Conservation now depends on restraint, long-term monitoring, and acceptance that perfect control is impossible. Chauvet entered modern history under stricter rules. Its entrance was secured soon after discovery, and access has remained limited to small scientific teams. Time inside is restricted, routes are fixed, light, equipment, clothing, and sampling are carefully managed. Researchers must gather enough information to justify their presence, while minimizing the changes that presence causes. The cave's exceptional preservation owes much to the prehistoric rockfall that sealed it, but its future depends on continuing that discipline. Microclimate studies show how sensitive the interior is to airflow, temperature, moisture, and seasonal change. A small alteration near the entrance can travel through the cave in ways that are not immediately obvious. Even a research campaign is therefore a negotiation between knowledge and preservation. Every photograph, sample, scan, and measurement has value, but access is not neutral. The most responsible study may sometimes be the one postponed until a less invasive method exists. Replicas emerge from this conflict. Lascaux II, later exhibitions, and the extensive reconstruction at Lascaux IV allow visitors to experience the panels without entering the original. Chauvet II. Ardèche recreates the sealed cave's imagery and topography in a compressed but controlled form. Artists, engineers, archaeologists, and digital specialists have reproduced color, relief, cracks, and mineral surfaces. These are not crude copies. They are interpretations built from immense quantities of measurement. Digital archaeology extends the same effort. Three-dimensional scans preserve geometry at high resolution. Virtual environments allow researchers to test sightlines, lighting ranges, movement, and panel relationships. They also create a record against which future changes can be compared. A crack that widens, a stain that spreads, or a surface that dulls can be measured rather than remembered impressionistically. Digital copies become instruments of conservation as well as public access. Yet every reconstruction clarifies what the original complicated. A replica has safe floors, regulated light, known exits, and no fear of damaging irreplaceable evidence. It can imitate the shape of the cave, but not the historical consciousness of those who entered before maps existed. It can reproduce the red palm print, but not the hesitation before the hand-touched stone. It can model torchlight, but not the social knowledge that determined who carried it, who followed, and why the group had come. The global record makes the old European story equally incomplete. Chauvet is one of the earliest monumental figurative cave complexes known in Europe. Not the birthplace of art. In Sulawesi, a hand stencil reported in 2026 carries a minimum age of about 67,800 years, placing complex rock-marking traditions far earlier than Chauvet and far from Western Europe. Other discoveries in Southeast Asia, Africa, Australia, and elsewhere continue to show that symbolic behavior did not awaken in one region and spread outward in a single line. This wider perspective does not diminish Lascaux or Chauvet, it makes them more precise. They are survivors from particular European traditions, preserved under rare geological conditions. Their fame once encouraged a story in which Western Europe stood at the beginning of art history. The evidence now points toward multiple populations, deep traditions, lost experiments, and enormous gaps caused by erosion, sea level change, weathering, and the disappearance of perishable materials. Most art made in the Ice Age is gone. Painted skin decayed, wood rotted, fibre vanished, open-air images weathered away. Coastlines that once held human communities now lie underwater. The caves survive not because underground art was the only art, but because darkness sometimes preserved what daylight destroyed. Their apparent abundance may distort the past, making one protected practice look more central than it was. What remains is enough to establish a profound fact. People living tens of thousands of years ago selected materials, trained hands, organized movement, built visual conventions, and placed images within environments designed by geology. They understood animals in detail and represented them according to cultural choices that exceeded diet. They used signs whose organization suggests shared information, though not a deciphered script. They shaped light, space, and perhaps sound into experiences that cannot be separated from the walls. What remains is not enough to identify one universal purpose. The caves may have held ritual, memory, teaching, mythology, social negotiation, aesthetic pleasure, and activities for which modern vocabulary has no name. Different chambers could serve different functions. Different visits could change the meaning. Different generations could inherit images without inheriting every explanation. Lascaux and Chauvet therefore refuse both extremes. They are neither simple hunting diagrams nor unreadable chaos. Their patterns are real, their techniques measurable, and their histories increasingly recoverable. But the final translation remains absent. Science can identify pigment, date charcoal, map acoustic response, reconstruct flame, and model movement. It cannot restore the vanished conversations that taught people what a lion panel meant, or why a certain sign belonged beside a horse. The caves still refuse us because they preserve the result without the key. Their walls endure, while the social worlds that made them intelligible have disappeared. Every advance narrows the mystery and reveals its depth. We know more clearly how the images were made, when some were made, and what conditions surrounded them. We still do not know what the makers believed they were doing when the darkness opened and the animals appeared. And so the journey returns to the threshold, where daylight waits beyond the stone. Behind us, the cave settles again into silence. The bulls remain on their curving walls. The lions continue their advance. The red hands hold their distance from bodies that vanished long ago. Nothing inside needs us in order to survive, and perhaps that is why entering must always be treated as a privilege rather than a right. Time has removed the voices, but not every gesture. A finger dragged through pigment still records its direction. A charcoal line still remembers pressure. A lamp hollow still holds the idea of flame. Footprints keep the measure of steps taken when the ground was softer. These traces are small, yet they cross an expanse of years so large that ordinary history seems brief beside it. The people who made them lived beneath changing skies, followed animals across cold landscapes, gathered around fires, learned from one another, and carried knowledge into the earth. They knew fatigue, weather, uncertainty, and familiar routes. They did not know that their caves would become museums without visitors, guarded by doors and censors. They could not imagine our arguments about art, religion, calendars, or symbolism. They made the marks for minds formed within their own world. We stand outside that world. We can measure the mineral and map the chamber. We can watch a digital flame move across a reconstructed wall. But the final step remains impossible. We cannot become the original audience. The distance remains, gentle but absolute, between a mark we can describe and a meaning we can inhabit. It reminds us that survival preserves matter unevenly, while memory, language, and intention are far more fragile. Perhaps that distance should not be treated only as failure. The mystery protects the makers from being reduced to one theory. It leaves room for complexity, for change, and for meanings that belong to more than one generation. The silence is not empty. It is the boundary of what evidence can honestly carry. Beyond the entrance, evening spreads across the landscape. The limestone cools. Wind moves through grass where other animals once passed. Far below, in chambers closed to breath and weather, a horse waits inside a curve of stone. It has waited through ice, warming, migration, discovery, damage, and repair. A light approaches only rarely now. For a moment, the line returns. Then the flame moves away, and the animal passes gently back into darkness.